Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the remaster for Quake 2 and its Deadzones. If you've seen my video on the Quake 1 remaster, everything there applies here, including the requests. So this video will be pretty redundant. The only real new stuff is the specific implementation of this game's Radial wheel. But otherwise I'm just going to recover everything, and so by default, the default camera dead zone is a 26% circle. Around the axes, there's some angular restriction. So if your stick is anywhere within these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of 4 directions. In this case, perfectly left, perfectly right, perfectly up, and perfectly down. And you have to move into these green regions before diagonal movement occurs. And this happens pretty abruptly, so it should be pretty easy to see. But this is most obvious when capping the view like this and looking for the horizontal movement. Now this occurring abruptly suggests that it's unscaled, meaning that, say, normally in this quadrant you have 90 degrees from here to here, and if this were scaled, that would mean that it would change this so your 90 degrees is instead from here to here. But being unscaled means that you have the same 90 degree range, but this restriction is just actually cutting into that range. So instead of starting at subtle angles, you start at more significant angles once you break out of this restricted range. For the movement, by default, we have a 24% circular dead zone, and the movement speed starts very slow. So sort of what I did for Quake 1 Remaster with its low resolution, you can see slow movement occur a little easier with the shimmering of pixels. And if you could see your shadow, the shadow begins running once you pass the dead zone as well. The angular restriction for movement is different than for the camera. So now Quake 2 seems to have a thing where if you're moving close enough to perfect at a wall, it just locks you in place. So there'll be a bit of a gap, but you can see that when moving far enough either way, you begin sliding along the wall. But when you're in this restricted region, you stay perfectly still. It isn't until you break out of this region where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. This is the only real difference between this remaster and the first ones. Is in the first remaster I had drawn some very slight angular spikes around the dead zone, and that was actually because the way I test diagonal movement for movement is I move forward and back with a slight offset. So like I'm moving slightly backwards and to the left here, and then I move slightly with the same horizontal offset, the opposite direction. And if I move from my reference point, as you can see I move left, then there is diagonal movement. Now with Quake 1, it seemed like if I moved backwards and to the left within that range, you would actually move slightly to the right, and then when I moved again, I actually drifted back into that position. And if I moved over here, I would actually still be moving right. So that could just be a slight quirk, and angular movement is occurring, but I've just interpreted that as restricted movement, and that could have been inappropriate. But otherwise, this is identical. That's the only difference between these two remasters. Oops. But looking at the maximum dead zone size, can see that the dead zone is a 50% circle, so the options are perfectly accurate. But the angular restriction is considerably bigger, so much more of your stick, in this case, is moving perfectly left. And since it remains unscaled, when you break into your diagonal movement, it happens even more abruptly. And again, looking straight up and down is much more clear, and you can see that horizontal movement begins much faster because you're breaking into a much larger angle. So you're restricting quite a bit of your, or losing quite a bit of your angles with this. Movement is also 50%, but it's still very difficult to demonstrate. So, but that is accurate, and the restricted range, or the restricted angular range, is the same shape, just smaller. So, showing the shape is a little difficult, but this is a 5% dead zone. But you can see the angular restriction is very slight, so that subtle angles are being reflected. Now, when looking up, you can see that there is some restriction, but when we break into diagonal movement, you can see that it is starting much slower because while it is still cropping off some angles, you do have access to much smaller angles than at other dead zone sizes. So this is one of two of the significant issues that carried over from the first remaster. I think in general, angular restriction like this is an issue because where you point your stick is not where the cursor goes, even if it were scaled. But with this implementation, the dead zone size directly affects how much restriction you get. So players who need to play at larger dead zones for whatever reason are forced to play at, forced to have more of their angles restricted, and since it's unscaled, completely lost. So they're actually losing angles compared to players playing at lower dead zones. So I think the two potential fixes for this is, one, just completely get rid of angular restriction completely, so that your cursor always moves in the same direction as your stick, so you always have full diagonal movement. Or if they want to keep it, add an option for the amount of restriction to add, and have this completely independent of the dead zone size, so that if a player wants, say, 30 degrees around each axis restricted, they're going to get 30 degrees around each axis regardless of their dead zone size. It'll be 30 degrees at 50% and 30 degrees at 5%. To finish up, speaking about the movement's angular restriction, see that this kind of we can see that the restriction has elongated quite dramatically, and at the previous two dead zone sizes, the closer to the dead zone it was, it kind of flared out towards the dead zone, but here it's kind of narrowing as it gets closer. I'm not sure which dead zone sizes it really becomes, starts taking the shape. Now to jump to the acceleration curve, I'm going to take this back up to the defaults. And once you break out of the dead zone, you start slightly slower than normal, and it follows a shallow S-curve until you reach the shaded region, where there's a spike in acceleration. It might be a little difficult to tell, but there's no acceleration, and this is accelerated. And it tapers off slightly with more stick input to until it reaches its maximum. So I had actually tested the curves at different dead zones and exponents in the Quake 1 Remaster, and I focused here on demonstrating the aim acceleration, because previously I had tested with at 0 for all my tests, and actually once you hit this acceleration jump at 0, any stick movement beyond that is all the same speed, so this becomes a functional outer dead zone. So if you're using some aim acceleration, there is a use of stick input beyond that threshold. But to look again at the maximum dead zone, we can see that acceleration begins quite a bit slower. It's much more of an exponential curve, and builds up and hits an acceleration jump once you hit the threshold, and then it tapers off with a slight bit of additional stick input. And this is a bug that happens occasionally, where it just locks you to certain numbers. Exiting and just hoping it works seems to fix it. So there. Went back to normal there. So here we have a very slightly slow but very quick transition to a steep increase, and then it begins tapering off, and then there's a jump in acceleration, about 50%. So again, it's a little difficult to see, but no turn acceleration with turn acceleration, and then it tapers off with the remaining stick range. Now again, I just said that at 0 aim accel, this is there's no additional speed with stick input. So if you're not using aim acceleration, this would be completely flat and functional outer dead zone. So this would mean that half your stick range of motion actually isn't doing anything, and actually a bit more than that, because you have the center dead zone not doing anything. So this is the second of the significant issues that carried over from the first Quake Remaster. The dead zone, similar to the angular restriction, directly affects the shape of the acceleration curve, as well as when it caps, or at least when it spikes. So this is a major issue, because this makes it so that lower dead zones are actually significantly less precise than larger dead zones, which is exactly contrary to what should happen. Using lower dead zones should give you more precision, across the board. But because of this implementation, it becomes increasingly difficult to control yourself. And I'm playing at, say, 8 sensitivity right now. But if there's a higher sensitivity player who wants to play at 20, this is, quite fast. But you can see that just making small stick movements creates very fast movements. And this is, a pretty fast sensitivity, but there are players, like especially Call of Duty players, who do play at the maximum sensitivity there, which is 1,000 or greater degrees per second. And the reason why they can play at that is because Call of Duty uses more exponential curves, and this doesn't change based on dead zone size. So players can either play at large or smaller dead zones and still have precise movements or speed values to have access to, so they can play or control the speed but still have a very fast output. That just simply isn't the case here. And you can see the dotted lines, the dashed and dotted lines. This is relative to the exponent. So this controls the intensity of the acceleration curve, and pushing this down, you can see that the acceleration jump doesn't occur until further out. And if you're using acceleration, of course it tapers off. If not, then it flatlines. And if you're using it 1, this builds up the fastest and then hits its acceleration jump at about 35%, and then either tapers off, or if you're not using aim acceleration, is completely flatline. So you know, at least 65% of your stick is considered 100% speeds. So this makes it very difficult to make precise adjustments, and the fix for this is simply make the curve consistent on any dead zone size. If you, for example, the default exponent of 2 at a default right stick dead zone of 26 was a nice shallow S-curve. That should be a nice shallow S-curve at a dead zone of 5 or 50%. So that should just be consistent no matter what. And that really would fix it. So that's really what needs to happen. And the exponent really shouldn't change the threshold for this acceleration jump to occur at. This should just be a static point, either relative to the acceleration or the stick value beyond, like the percentage past the dead zone, or flat outer dead zone value. That's a little difficult for me to describe, but for example in Halo does this, where at its default about 27% dead zone, acceleration triggers at 90, but if you're playing at a 0% dead zone, it triggers at 85%. So it's relative to the range of the acceleration range, it's not including the dead zone. But that's what this how this should function. And I want to make it clear again, like, the options here are excellent. We have dead zone options, we have curve options, we have acceleration options, and separate X and Y sensitivities. And these are the same, so that's good. It's not like the Y is secretly lower than the X. So the options here are excellent. It's just the acceleration is dependent on the dead zone size and wildly inconsistent because of that. And the axial angular restriction is also dependent, and there's no way to completely either remove it with an option, or it's always active in some way. So addressing these two issues could make this easily one of the best controlling games in the industry, but these two issues really hold it back. I didn't really cover this, and let me at least mitigate this. I don't really cover movement curves, but these changes could really help movement as well. Movement is of course not quite as important because mouse and keyboard players only have 8 directions to work with, and usually only 1 to 2 speeds, if they choose to walk or toggle walking. But controllers, the left stick still has full range of angular and magnitude values to choose from. And removing the angular restriction would be beneficial here too, or adding separate options. But the curve here is interesting because it's different, but still has similar problems. The curve starts out very slow, and then has a steep spike, and then sort of tapers off. Well, still fastly builds, but then tapers off as you move further. So having this change to just be like a simple linear curve or a shallow exponential would make this more consistent. You could have a smoother access to your gradient of speed. Again, movement isn't too important, but this would be a great bit of polish for the movement as well. Now, and I've tested this point, and you can see how this the curve changes at the default dead zones and the minimum and maximums to see how the curve is influenced similarly by the dead zone size. So that covers the stick controls. The only thing new is the radial wheel. So one great improvement here, one issue that I had uh, with Quake 1's implementation is the right stick dead zone was also applied to the wheel, and you can kind of see that here. Once I break out of this, you can see that it's where the cursor is. And in Quake 1, that would automatically highlight weapons, so if I pointed up towards the blaster, it would automatically select it. Here, now you have to move into this donut range, about 55%, before you're able to select weapons. And the reason why this was an issue is because when you selected a weapon and say release the stick, there could be a bounce back, and because the dead zone was small enough, it accidentally bounce further than the dead zone and select things on the opposite side of the wheel. Additionally, because you can imagine a radial wheel as a pizza or a kind of pie with these slices. So when you're moving the stick fully, you have about this range to select the blaster. But when you right around the dead zone, that same angle only has a very slight range. So it's much easier to bleed into adjacent weapons with that smaller dead zone. So having this standardized across all right stick dead zones is a great fix. Unfortunately, there are two other issues that were added with this change. So the first one is, if I have a shotgun here, so I have the blaster equipped, and you can see if I want to pick the shotgun, but I center it, I don't actually select the shotgun. And actually that is interesting because I've released the stick, but it fell within the dead zone, and I think that if it, the cursor position isn't updated if it falls within the dead zone. So you can see here that that same thing isn't applying. So for the most part, if it falls within this, you don't select that weapon. And I don't know how big of an issue this actually is, because if you switch fast, then there's no problem at all. But I can see if someone's switching slower that this may result in some dropped weapons. I think this makes sense for the item wheel. Maybe you have something selected and you don't want to actually use it, like a quad damage or something, and you want to let your stick fall under and then just release it so you don't actually use an item. I'm not sure how full the item wheel gets, but I mean, you can always, if you don't want to select the quad, you can always just, select off to an empty spot. But if you switch fast, I'm not sure how the average, weapon swap speed for players is, so it might not be an issue at all during general gameplay. The bigger issue, however, is the position of the weapons is malleable. So with the Quake 1 Remaster and most other games, weapons on the wheel are at fixed positions. So if you pressing right, it's always going to be the same weapon, and if you don't have it, you just don't have it. It's just grayed out. So that's how it worked in the Quake 1 Remaster. But if we go down here, we have two weapons right here, and we pick up this rocket launcher, we can see that it occupies the third space. But if I switch back to the blaster and pick up the rocket launcher and the hyper blaster, and I think it should be in the third place, but I picked up now I swapped to grenades, because the true position of the rocket launcher is somewhere right here, and it depends on the size of the wheel. So what it's doing is it's queuing up the weapons in order, and then just shifting them until they reach their true position. So it's very inconsistent where a weapon will be depending on the amount of weapons you have and what order you've collected on. As you can see, the hyper blaster comes after the rocket launcher. So I think this issue is obvious, but to compare it to explain it to, say, mouse and keyboard players, I mean, this would be like if you have, no one uses number keys anymore, but if you had a weapon on 5, but it didn't start on 5, you could press 2 for that weapon, 2, 3, 4, and until you got enough weapons for it to finally migrate to the 5th key. So I think this is something that could change, so that weapons are always in the exact space that they should be in, so that it's always reliable. Now, this probably isn't too big of an issue in the campaign. I noticed I was kind of tripped up when I got the BFG and it kind of offset the rocket launcher a bit. But well, at least in the campaigns, you have the same amount of weapons for extended periods of time. If you're playing multiplayer, you're constantly dying and picking up new weapons, and the weapons are going to be constantly in different positions. So you're going to have to be eyeballing which placement each weapon's on instead of having a reliable one. You should always just be able to know that, say, the BFG is always up here and the railgun's always over here, and the hyper blaster and rocket launcher and so on. So you should always be aware of it, so it can just be muscle memory. If I want the blaster, I just know which weapons I want. If I want the rocket launcher, I can do that, and the hyper blaster that. Just because I know what directions to push in. So those are things that need to be corrected just with the wheels, just to make this the positions consistent. And I don't know too much. I don't think the swapping matters too much. You can see that it's swapping fine if you're doing it fast, so that may not be an issue at all. But at least for weapons, I think once you've highlighted it, having it stay highlighted would completely avoid any accidental dropped inputs from selection. Now, I do want to give a ton of praise for this wheel. I love how responsive it is. I mean, you can see that you can switch weapons quickly, and of course faster weapon switching was one of the major improvements of this remaster. But having a instantly responsive wheel is wonderful, and so many games try to overload the wheel button with a secondary input, like if you tap the wheel button you get your previous weapon, but by doing that it forces latency on the wheel, so you really have to wait for the wheel to be available. So this is a great thing, and was the case in the first remaster. So that about covers things. As a quick summary, I think either removing the angular restriction entirely or adding options to control it and properly scale it so that players can choose how much they want and get an idealized form of it. Make it so that the acceleration curve doesn't, the shape doesn't change with the dead zone. It's the same curve at any dead zone size. That'd be great for consistency. Again, there are excellent options available. It's just the implementation of these two things really hold it back. Movement, I think getting rid of the angular restriction as well as just using a simple linear curve for the speed transition would be an improvement here. Movement's the least important part, but that would be an improvement too. One thing I didn't really mention is I think it'd be nice to be able to get dead zones lower than 5, so have the slider go from 0 to 50 instead of 5 to 50, and maybe with a ideally functioning curve, having smaller increments. So this is a decent bit of customization, but having 0.1 instead of 0.5 increments would give more granular control, so players could more finely tune the exact curve they want. And lastly, maybe just make it so that weapons, once they're highlighted, remain highlighted, and we could just, like the item wheel can just remain as is. I think it functions fine, but just have weapons remain highlighted so that any potential for accidental or dropped inputs is removed, and have all the weapons stay in their correct set placements. So I've been talking for a while. Hopefully we can see these improvements made. Quake 1, of course, got a significant first update, and I don't know if that'll happen with 2, but maybe they'll add add-on support like the first one got, and hopefully we can see these improvements made with any update. And if these improvements are made here, hopefully they could add an update for the first one because the issues, at least the stick issues, are identical in both, and this would really greatly improve them. And again, I keep saying it, the options here are excellent. Once the functionality of the acceleration and angular restriction are improved, this could easily be among the best controlling shooters out there. And Quake definitely deserves it, and that'd be a great thing to see. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and everyone have a good rest of your day.